Let's talk about resistance for a minute. It's something that throws a lot of people off. It's a pretty common concept in vaping. Some folks really got their hands around it, some folks not an idea. So we'll just kind of start from scratch, and assuming that that throws you off, I apologize if this is old ground for a lot of folks, but it is pretty critical to controlling your vape experience. Resistance. It's an electrical property of generally your atomizer or your coil. The batteries do have resistance, but they're managed internally, and generally you don't need to worry about it. But in general, what it is just how hard the electrons have to work to get through something. And the more force that's applied to those electrons, we call that force voltage, the easier they can go through there, or the harder they're pushed, and the more resistance there is, in other words, the harder it's pushing back, the more voltage you need to overcome that. So the two are really in a relationship with each other, and that's touched on in Ohm's law. There's another factor in that base law called current, which is how many electrons are actually making it through that point in a given period of time. But the resistance, why do we care? Because in most devices, they'll use that as their starting point. They check that first and then set their voltage or their power accordingly to overcome that resistance and have the proper number of electrons going through, i.e. current flow. Now, there's a nice relationship between them, and they're really relatively easy to figure out once you get your hands around the math, but we won't get into the math side of it at all, except to explain what they are. It's, again, just how hard your particular device that you're measuring. You can measure the resistance of a battery. They have internal resistance. The connections, they have resistance. Whatever that piece is that you're segmenting off, we're talking about just that. And in general, it's usually your coil. All the other numbers kind of disappear into the fudge work of the mod itself. Don't worry about that. We're talking about just generally the coil itself. But how hard an electron has to work to get through that coil. Now, things that can affect that are the coil length. If it's a longer coil, it's going to push back harder. If it's a thinner wire, it's going to have a harder time. Fewer electrons can actually get through at a given point. But it is a basic electrical property. It's a function of physics. Physics, we can use math to determine ahead of time what it should be, and it usually almost always exactly is. So they can use that predictability to use your mod voltage based on the resistance. So when we're talking about wattage, that's exactly what we are. It's the culmination of these numbers. Wattage means if you do this and that, you'll always get that same result. So as this goes down, that has to go up, and vice versa. And that's the principle of how most mods work, is they'll check your atomizer resistance. Then when you have a wattage number set, it will use that to calculate the resulting voltage. And the voltage is, again, how hard those electrons are pushed through that resistance. In other words, it's actually how hard this pole is pulling to get them through. But the more you pull, the more it can overcome greater and greater resistances. A lot of people like to use the analogy of water. If it didn't work for you before, it probably won't again, but it is the most realistic analogy. Just literally imagine the slope of a mountain. The more sloped it is, that would represent voltage. The more tipped it is, the harder the water is going to run down. Now imagine you put a rock in there. That's resistance. It has to work to overcome that presence, that force. And so the bigger the rock, the more resistance, the more that water's energy is diverted around and through it. And so the more tilt you would have for it to actually flow over that rock instead of just around it. But I'm getting lost in my analogies. The general principle would be the voltage is how tipped that mountain hill would be, and the resistance is just how much is blocking that free flowing water. And in a zero resistance situation, it would literally just be falling straight down without hitting anything. As you add resistance, you maybe add some gravel to the bottom, then some pebbles, then higher resistance, you'd add some boulders, and then maybe all the way up at the top, you'd have a whole forest and a muck, and the water couldn't even go down anymore. It was just a swamp, tilted. That can happen, but all that would be the resistance is the stuff in the stream, and the voltage is how tipped the stream is. Now, if you put a water wheel at the bottom and just said how many, pieces of corn can grind in 2 hours, that would be a function of wattage. That would be a resulting number from those two basic inputs, how hard it wants to get there and how hard it's being pressed against a resistance. So again, in the atomizer and in the vaping world, resistance is very, very important, and a lot of things affect it, but in general, it is a function of how hard that electron has to work to get through all the coiling and everything and back to the where it wants to go, back to the battery. So that force pushing back against it is resistance. That force that's trying to overcome that resistance is voltage, and most batteries have a fixed 4.2 to 3.2 voltage range, but in general that's a fairly fixed number for most mods. That's why they play with the atomizer resistance or use the power that they send, because there's only so many things they have involved or that they have control over. They can't rebuild your coil, they can't make your battery put out more power, so they have to moderate the amount of voltage that they send to get that vape experience. And in temperature control, they use that resistance to also then determine what the temperature of the coil is based on a lot of assumptions on how that number works. So, but in general, voltage, how bad the water wants to get down, resistance, how bad it's being pushed against. In vaping terms, it'd be the size of the coil, the thickness of the wire, the number of wraps, the length of your legs, the quality of your connections. So, hope that helps. It's a tricky one, but once you get your arms around it, a lot of vaping things start to become aha moments. Have a good one.